Tip 5. Do all your opening entities, for example, tags like this table tag, divs, opening parentheses, opening braces, etc., have corresponding closing entities. Now, for example, if I go to the closing table tag and I delete that, let's have a look at what happens to the layout here. I'm refreshing. You can see the layout is completely broken. All those products are no longer visible. I would have caught this bug if I were rigorous enough to check that the opening table entity up there in line 27 has a closing entity, and here it does not. Another way to detect this is to format the code, and you can see here that the final statement here is indented by 2 spaces, whereas you'd expect it to be all the way across horizontally. This is indicative of a missing closing entity. Let me give you another example of where rigor is called for with closing entities, parentheses as it relates to precedence in this case. So here I have a typical product page. I submit that to Google via sitemap. This is the code for generating the sitemap. I loop through individual products I have in each store I serve, and then I use this custom function adds to add to the sitemap. And here I calculate the path for that particular product, and I pass into the sitemap the last mod attribute, and I set that to the updated out of a particular product to tell Google that this particular page was last modified whenever that product was last modified. This is in order to save crawl budget. So let's take a look at the sitemap generated by this. It actually has a bug. There's no entry in the sitemap.xml for the last mod. In fact, the last mod is added as an attribute to the particular URL, even though that has no meaning within my website. So what's gone wrong? If we look over here, there's actually 2 functions. First, there's this add function. You don't have to have parentheses in Ruby for functions, but I'll add them here to be clearer. So we have this add function, and then inside that add function we have the revision notes path function, and this accepts product and last mod. However, the last mod doesn't belong here. The last mod belongs with the add function. So what I really should have done is add a closing parenthesis here and remove the closing parenthesis here. Now, if I run that code again, I will get the correct sitemap, and I've run this earlier and you can have a look at it. The actual URL doesn't have a last mod attribute, and the last mod attribute instead exists within the sitemap as it should. Tip 6. Are the constants or other entities referred to defined in A, this file? What do I mean by this? Let me open up this translations file I tend to use. So you can see here it's kind of a self-contained translation unit. I have these English and German translations for various terms, a function to switch the locale, a function to translate a given key and find what the translation is, and so on. This sets it to a default locale. So originally I had this in my React Native app, but then I wanted to include it in my React Web app. So I tested it pretty thoroughly in the React Native one, then I copied pasted it into the React Web one, and then committed it and sent it to a coworker. Of course, it did not work in that context. Why? Because I referred here to the i118n module, which is imported here. However, this was not imported within the other project, so I made an assumption about the context which was untrue. Are the constants or other entities referred to defined in this environment? By environment, I mean things like development, staging, production, test, and so on. Let me give you an example of where this went wrong for me recently. In PHP Laravel, they have these things called app service providers. This gets called, or rather the register function of this gets called when the app gets booted, something like that. I'm not so familiar with the internals, it doesn't matter. And what I wanted to do here was define a macro for the browser entity, which I use in acceptance testing. This comes via the Laravel Dusk package, and this macro allows me to fill in hidden fields on the screen. This worked perfectly in test. However, when I tried to run this on production or in staging, the whole thing failed. Why was that? Well, if you look here at the composer.json file, this is kind of the equivalent of package.json. It's where you include libraries for PHP. And this Laravel Dusk package, where browser is defined, is only available in required dev instead of the normal dependencies. Therefore, this constant over here, browser, is only available in dev and testing whenever those dev dependencies are loaded. Therefore, this will fail in the typical case. The way around this is to wrap the whole thing in an if statement. Basically something like if the environment is test, then you can define that macro. Next, are the constants or other entities referred to defined in this namespace? So I'm going to pop over to this send invitations file over here. The first important thing to note is that this is contained within the app/jobs namespace. It is not top level. Anyway, this send invitations job, when it gets called via this handle method. The first thing it does is check if the event passed to it has invitations already sent. If so, it throws an exception. Otherwise, it alerts via email and SMS. This code had a bug in it. The issue is that even though PHP has an exception, it is not present within app/jobs. Therefore, it failed with exception not being found. What I had to do is say that exception was contained in the top level namespace like so, in order for it to work. Be aware of what constants are contained within your current namespace. Lastly, are the constants or other entities referred to defined on this platform? Okay, for example, in my production website, I have this feature on my downloads page that whenever someone downloads a particular file, this thing comes up saying that the download was accessed. This is part of fraud control, and you can see the corresponding code right over here, this track download function. The important part here is that I use the fetch API. When I first wrote this code, I assumed fetch was available on all browsers. However, that is completely untrue. Let me demonstrate that by opening up the Can I Use website for fetch. Here you can see that it's not supported on Internet Explorer, it's not supported on Edge 12.13, not supported on much of Firefox, not supported at all on Opera Mini. Therefore, a certain percentage of my users, in fact you can see here, 94% of my users are able to use fetch, 5% aren't. Therefore I had to polyfill this. An important thing for you to check is whether the features you're using, such as fetch here, are actually available on the platform you're targeting. This is also true, for example, when you use special features on MySQL. I want to program an application with a bunch of features, assuming that the latest MySQL will be running on production. However, there was a limitation there and it could only run 5.7, despite the fact that I programmed it in 8, I believe. Therefore, we had to get rid of a load of features. So I should have checked beforehand, if I was being more rigorous, what does my platform support before writing any code. Point 7. At the boundaries between two languages or systems, are you translating to the correct data format and naming conventions expected on the other side? Interfaces between systems have a tendency towards breakage that, no pun intended, borders on maniacal. Thus, extra caution is always warranted here. A common, air quotes, dumb mistake is forgetting to translate data into a format that can be understood by the other side and accurately preserves meaning. I'll present a couple of examples of this. My first example will be interfacing with the command line, a Unix command line. Many programs call out to other binaries that are available on the command line. So for demonstrative purposes, let me show you a file I have here. lawandorder.txt, I believe. Let's have a look inside and you can see the contents of it there. Now let's try to work with that file from within Ruby. I'm opening up a pry instance, that's basically a REPL here. Now let's assign that file to a variable, we'll call it file. And now I'm going to use the system commands to call out to the underlying shell. I'm going to pass it in the cat binary and then that particular file using string interpolation. And it fails. You know that because it returns false. Let's look at the particular failure. Cat attempts to open law, and there's no such file or directory, then a file called and, then a file called order.txt, i.e. it's splitting this entire file name into 3 separate file names or 3 separate shell words. The general solution is to be mindful of this interface between Ruby and the underlying shell. Most programming languages have utilities for passing arguments to the shell. One that's available in Ruby is this thing called shellwords.escape. So if I call that here on the file argument, everything works as expected. What this does is wrap up the overall file name in a shell word in a single instance, so to speak, and that makes everything work as expected. You could, of course, do something simpler here, like wrap the whole thing in a quote, as I'm doing here. That will work, although that's not as general a solution to this class of problems. Another example of this kind of error is assuming that data types that look similar in one program, the sending program, can be correctly received by another program receiving that data. In this file, we have an array of objects with either strings or numbers as their values. The syntax for creating this is identical in Ruby, in Python, and JavaScript. This leads to the temptation of sending this data exactly as is to another program. This, however, will not work because a Ruby array is encoded differently. It has a different set of bytes than a Python or a JavaScript array. Therefore, when you try to dump that array out of a program and into another, it just won't work. You have to rely on some sort of data transfer medium like JSON and so on, at least most of the time. Let me give you an example. Here I've added a products to my cart. In order to pass the payment details to my client-side PayPal implementation, I need to get some data from my backend into this page. Here you can see I've attached some JSON to this window.oxnotes.payment variable. You can see it here. I can also access that directly within JavaScript. Here's window.oxnotes.payment. You can see it has application context, intent, payment, some transactions, all that kind of stuff. This corresponds to this bit of code in my backend. I have a script tag where I run some JavaScript. Window.oxnotes.payment equals the HTML raw version of this payment bit of JSON. Let's see what happens if I just send a Ruby array to the browser instead of explicitly transforming it into JSON as I currently do. So I'm going to open up my payment gateway file. There we go. And this is the function I'm using to generate that payment object that I'm sending to JavaScript right now. And I call toJSON on that. So let me delete that and then go back to the browser and refresh and see what happens. I get an uncaught syntax error. If I try to access the window.oxnotes.payment, it doesn't work. Let's have a look at what's created here. This looks very weird and different. It's using an odd Ruby syntax for the object that isn't compatible with JavaScript. Basically, it's just created a mess. You've got to take data interchange seriously when you're being rigorous about programming. Ideally, you should use a first-party tool like the toJSON method I have there, or some sort of other core language feature. There are a lot of subtleties you might not expect when transforming data into JSON or some other sort of interchange format. For example, I was once tripped up when passing a string containing new lines to JSON without using a transformer. This is because JSON reserves the new line character internally, and therefore you need to escape it. A bit of rigor here could have helped me avoid this issue. Last but not least, I want to bring up something related. Watch out for naming convention differences between languages. For example, in a lot of backend code, Ruby included, snake case is used. For example, item_list. Whereas in the JavaScript world, programs expect camel case, something like this. If you accidentally call the camel case version in JavaScript land without having transformed your Ruby data to have the alternative naming convention, then you're going to get a failure. This is a very common mistake. The way I get around that is to automatically transform the keys of objects into camel case at the seams between my Ruby and JavaScript. For example, all incoming data that gets used gets transformed using this function here, camel case keys. Let me give you an example on the now fixed window.oxnotes.payment JSON. You can see here it's now in camel case. It's application context instead of underscore context, brand name, and so on and so forth. In Oxbridge Notes, I do that transformation on the front end. However, in another one of my projects, I do this in the back end from the API. Before returning any JSON, I call parent camel case keys, and you can see the definition for this here. I haven't a strong preference for where this occurs. What matters is that it should occur transparently and that you never have to really think about it. That's all for today. See you next Sunday.